Let's break down 3 wide receivers, 3 running backs, 2 quarterbacks, and 2 tight ends that I think you need to try and buy low on and trade for now before week 3 of 2024 fantasy football. These are all players that I think you can buy low at the moment and that you should try and trade for before week 3's action. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 3 pick'ems have been going live all week, and if you want to claim a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's action, Patrick Mahomes over half of a total yard, you can do so by signing up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. And on top of that, all Underdog users are going to claim a free CeeDee Lamb over half of a total yard. So that's 2 free pick'ems for any new Underdog customers. Plus, you're going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That's free pick'ems and up to $1,000 on Underdog in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. All right, first player we're going to talk about for the week is wide receiver Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. Rashid Shaheed has been stealing the show to start the year at the wide receiver position for the Saints, coming in at 16.3 and 20.9 fantasy points in his first 2 performances on the season, scoring a touchdown in each of the first 2 games. Chris Olave has kind of been the odd man out so far in this Saints offense. I mean, we were seeing Derek Carr light it up through the air. Like I said, Shaheed's balling out. Alvin Kamara just had a 4-touchdown game. We saw 2 different tight ends scored in week 1 against the Panthers. But these game scripts, I think, are what's really important here. You know, Chris Olave has just not really been necessary. Shaheed has scored early in both games so far. And other than that, I mean, against the Panthers and the Cowboys, the Saints have been in complete control and have been running the football down both of these teams' throats. We're seeing the Panthers and the Cowboys as 2 of the worst run defenses in the NFL to start this season. But now, this next couple of games over this stretch here, we're going to see the Eagles, the Falcons, the Chiefs, the Bucks in the next coming weeks for the Saints. These are going to be more competitive game scripts, games where the Saints need to throw the football more, and Chris Olave is going to be much more involved in these games, a player who had 3.1 fantasy points in week 1 and a better performance in week 2 with 12.8 fantasy points. But I still think he is a wide receiver that a lot of fantasy managers are looking at as collateral damage to their roster potentially because he was drafted in most drafts as a second-round player. So I do believe that there are enough fantasy managers panicked on Chris Olave who don't think his ceiling is high, or maybe his ceiling is lowered because of the performances we've seen out of Shaheed and or Kamara. But moving forward, Chris Olave is going to be in a position where he's going to get more targets, more receptions, and eventually find the end zone. And this week against the Eagles, this awful secondary is as good of an opportunity as Chris Olave might get all season long. So I don't know if you're going to be able to buy him low after week 3. So go out and trade for Chris Olave now. And next up, let's talk about another wide receiver drafted early in most drafts. That's Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. We all know the story here. Held out of training camp, got the big contract, then got the Sauce Gardner treatment in week 1, dropped a touchdown that he should have caught. Then in week 2, it was better, but just 8.3 fantasy points. He's had 5 targets in both games. But now we're looking at this Niners offense going into week 3. And I want to point out a couple things. The first things is Jets defense week 1, Sauce Gardner treatment, not good for Aiyuk. Week 2, the Minnesota Vikings through the first 2 weeks of the season, one of the best defenses in the NFL. They look great. But here in week 3, the Niners will be at the Rams, and this defense absolutely decimated. This offense is absolutely decimated. This defense got shredded last week by Kyler Murray and company, and their wide receiver 1, Marvin Harrison Jr. Deebo Samuel's hurt. George Kittle also coming in as questionable and currently not practicing at the time recording this, might not play. We know Jordan Mason's the RB1 filling in for CMC. This is why the Niners, gave Brandon Aiyuk this massive contract to play as a true wide receiver 1. So he is going to be the vocal point of the offense in this matchup against the Rams, who, like I said, it's a beautiful matchup for Aiyuk. Everything's there for him. I don't know if you're going to be able to buy low on Aiyuk after week 3 because I think fantasy managers are going to be reminded of why they still took a gamble and drafted Aiyuk earlier in drafts this offseason. So he's going to be better as the season goes on. And this is just a fantastic matchup to remind us of why Brandon Aiyuk was a top 15 fantasy wide receiver last year. So don't know if you're going to be able to go out and buy him low after week 3. Do it now. Trade for Brandon Aiyuk now. I don't think you're going to regret it as the season goes on. All right, the last wide receiver I want to talk about is Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. And I think this is a very good buy low opportunity, probably the easiest buy low opportunity of any of the wide receivers that we talked about today. And that's because Jordan Addison's coming off of the ankle injury that he initially suffered in the offseason. And he missed week 2 of the season because he re-aggravated that injury in week 1. And then, we've still got like the DUI stuff kind of hanging over, like a, cloudy, rainy cloud over Jordan Addison. So I think for most fantasy managers, like they're not super confident in starting him right now. Might just look like a roster clogger. And at the end of the day, what we have to really look at is the fact that this Vikings passing attack has been great through the first 2 weeks of the season against the Giants and the Niners. And then they get another decent matchup against the Houston Texans, still coming in as a bottom 12 team against the wide receiver position in fantasy football in week 3. So maybe not as good against the Packers and the Jets in the next 2 weeks, but the advantage that Jordan Addison has is that Justin Jefferson's on the field and he has to take the primary defensive pressure. But we've seen, a player like Jalen Naylor come in this passing offense and be very effective at the wide receiver position with a touchdown in week 1 and a touchdown in week 2. And this passing attack for the Vikings, this Kevin O'Connell offense is going to continue to roll as the season goes on. They have their bye week in week 6. And after that bye week, they face the Rams, the Colts, and the Jaguars 3 weeks in a row. So I really think that as the season goes on, especially after the bye week, Jordan Addison has had that time to rest and everything, that he's going to be a very viable fantasy option. Just don't forget, Addison last year was a top 25 wide receiver in fantasy football, 911 receiving yards, 10 total touchdowns. As long as this Vikings offense and Sam Darnold are rolling, Addison, when healthy, is going to continue to be a viable flex option. So I think you should trade for Jordan Addison now before we start to see all of that actually happen. All right, next up, moving to the running back position, let's talk about Zach Charbonnet of the Seattle Seahawks. I think he's a great buy low candidate because he's still the RB2 on this team. So it's looking like the trend is kind of looking like Zach Charbonnet might be the RB1 in week 3 with Kenneth Walker potentially missing week 3 due to that oblique injury, which the Seahawks have already said that they're coming out and wanting to be very, very cautious with Kenneth Walker. And as of the time of recording this, Kenneth Walker has not been practicing this week. So looks like, although on the roster, Charbonnet is the RB2, that in week 3, similar to week 2, he's going to be the RB1 again. But we've seen Zach Charbonnet play as an RB2 in week 1 and score a receiving touchdown, walk away with 12 fantasy points. And week 2, as the RB1 with Walker out, he scored 17.9 fantasy points and found the end zone. He's also been involved in the passing game. So I think what's important here is that Zach Charbonnet is going to be a potential fantasy option, fantasy starter, whether Kenneth Walker is healthy or not. But then the big thing here is in week 3, the Seahawks have a great opportunity at home against a bad Miami Dolphins defense, specifically bad against the run, to come out and have a big offensive performance against a Dolphins team that's struggling right now, missing their starting quarterback, right? So I like Zach Charbonnet a lot in week 3. I think he's going to play as the RB1, and I just don't know exactly if you're going to be able to buy him low after week 3. So I think right now is the best opportunity to do so. Maybe as the season goes on, we get a couple games where Kenneth Walker's the primary RB1 and Charbonnet, isn't as fortunate as he was in week 1, doesn't score a touchdown. We see some lower performances fantasy-wise out of him. Those would maybe be good opportunities too. But right now, if you can get him before Sunday's slate of games, he's another smash start moving into the week. So trade for him before this matchup against the Dolphins. Moving along, we've got Brian Robinson Jr. of the Washington Commanders, a player who made last week's video as well. And I don't know if it's going to be as easy to trade for him going into week 3 as it was potentially going into week 2 because we've seen more injuries to the running back position. Part of my argument last week was, well, Brian Robinson in a lot of drafts was drafted as an RB4, RB3 to teams, so he might just be hanging out on the bench. And maybe that's still the case, but it kind of depends on, fantasy owner in your specific league. But the reason to go out and trade for Brian Robinson Jr. is because he's just going to continue to be the vocal point of this Washington Commanders offense. He's currently sitting as the RB11 in fantasy football. He's getting all the touches on the ground. We saw a little bit more involvement out of Austin Eckler last week, but we also saw an additional 5 carries for Brian Robinson with 17 compared to week 1's 12 total touches. And once again, we're continuing to see 3 or more targets in each game for Brian Robinson Jr. So as these seasons go on, as the weeks go on in the season, we're going to continue to see more and more double-digit performances out of Brian Robinson Jr., currently averaging 16.3 fantasy points per game. So he's just going to continue to be one of those guys you can plug in as an RB2, someone you can rely on if you're, missing a flex option for the week. He's going to face the Bengals, the Cardinals, the Browns, the Ravens, and the Panthers. A pretty solid stretch of games there in the next coming weeks. And once again, I still think for a lot of rosters, he might not be a primary starter, a guy who's not always making the starting lineup for your league mate. So go out and try and take advantage of that early, because I think as the season starts to go on, fantasy managers are just going to realize Brian Robinson is a player I want to keep on my team because he's consistent and he's bringing a safe floor on a week in, week out basis. So go try and secure that safe floor for your fantasy roster now. All right, last running back I want to talk about is Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's been dealing with that groin injury he suffered in week 2's matchup against the Lions, so he has a lot of fantasy managers spooked. And when fantasy managers are spooked, this is a good time to try and target the players that they are spooked on. So, bad day in week 2 against a good Lions run defense. Just 3.3 total fantasy points, dealing with that groin injury. We know that Bucky Irving is also looming around. He didn't have much success at all against the Lions run defense either, but should be better this week against the Denver Broncos. At the time of recording this, Rachaad White has practiced Friday, which is today. So that's a good sign that he's going to play this week, but I still think that fantasy managers are spooked on Rachaad White as a total because the injury has popped up. Bad performance in week 2 fantasy-wise and in real life as well. And then Bucky Irving is still kind of hanging around. But this is going to be a better performance as long as Rachaad White is healthy against this Denver Broncos defense. That is nothing to be worried about at the running back position. Then they get the Eagles, another good opportunity in week 4. And Rachaad White just continues to be one of those players that even if he's going up against a tough run defense, as long as he's healthy, the Buccaneers are still going to get him involved in the passing game. So Rachaad White, just don't forget, in full PPR, a top 5 running back last year. Don't be too scared about Bucky Irving. Don't be too worried about this injury. He is practicing this week, and I think he's going to have a big performance against the Broncos in week 3. So before your league mate sees that, trade for Rachaad White now. All right, moving on to the quarterback position. Let's look at Rachaad White's teammate. That'll be Baker Mayfield. He's currently the QB1 in fantasy football. But I think a lot of, fantasy managers who own Baker Mayfield are going to be willing to sell Baker Mayfield high because it's very unlikely that they actually drafted Baker Mayfield. And he's probably the QB2 on their team. But we do have some, people who maybe had Jordan Love or Tua and they need Baker Mayfield. But if you're looking at a roster, especially Baker Mayfield is not even going to start, you should be going out and buying Baker Mayfield if you're struggling at the quarterback position. But even if you're not, I think Baker's going to be solid over the next couple of weeks. I've talked a lot about Baker, talked a lot about him in the offseason going into the year, but talked a lot about him going into week 1 and into week 2. And the main point I'm going to make that you should be trying to trade for Baker Mayfield, even if you wait and maybe want to buy him after maybe he has a poor performance. Although I don't know if that's going to happen against the Broncos or the Eagles in the next 2 weeks, but I just love the end stretch for the Buccaneers after their week 11 bye week. They get the Giants, the Panthers, the Raiders. Chargers is tough. Then they get the Cowboys and the Panthers again. So two of those, week 16 and 17, are times where you're going to want Baker Mayfield starting in the fantasy playoffs, the semi-championship and the actual championship. And then everything leading up to that, those are those weeks that you're really trying to make sure you're securing wins to get the best position, best seeding in the fantasy playoffs. So I think he's going to be a super solid quarterback to have on the back end of the fantasy season. So even if you wait, he gets the Ravens week 7, Falcons week 8, Chiefs week 9, 49ers week 10. I think he can still come out of those games with good performances, but maybe you wait until a poorer performance overall, because all quarterbacks are going to have those in fantasy, and then you trade for them. But I think right now, against Denver and Philly, he's going to have another 2 solid weeks. So maybe you have a fantasy manager in your league trying to sell Baker Mayfield. I say go ahead and scoop him up, even if you're not starting him. That second half stretch of the season for Baker Mayfield and the Bucs going to be super solid for fantasy. So go ahead and buy him while you can. Last quarterback we're going to talk about is Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. 8.06 fantasy points in week 1. 17.2 in week 2. But Joe Burrow, if you watch that game against the Chiefs, looked much, much better. 23 of 36, 258 total passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Ran the ball 6 times for 9 yards. Interesting. But, I know the fumbles have been kind of an issue this year for Joe Burrow, but overall, week 2 looked much more in command of the game, looked much better overall. And this offense is going to continue to get better as Jamar Chase gets back into the swing of things, him holding out, and then T. Higgins, once he's back and healthy, this offense will look better, and they're especially going to look better against the Washington Commanders in week 3. If they are not the worst defense in the whole NFL, then the Carolina Panthers are, and that's who the Bengals play in week 4. So if you can go buy Joe Burrow low, and I'm sorry, that's Eminem. There's Joe Burrow. If you want to go buy Joe Burrow now because you feel like you can, then do so, because he's going to ball out these next 2 weeks. And the Bengals offense is going to look the opposite of how they looked in the first 2 weeks. They're going to look great against the Commanders and the Panthers. And then after that, I don't know if you're going to be able to buy Joe Burrow as low, but averaging this 12.6 fantasy points through the first 2 games of the season. Like I said, Chase is going to be better. Higgins is going to be back within the next week or 2, and they have literally the 2 worst defenses in the NFL lined up in the next 2 weeks. Go trade for Joe Burrow while you can. All right, last but not least, let's quickly talk about 2 tight ends. I'm going to start with Jake Ferguson, sitting at just 4.5 fantasy points on the season because he got hurt in that week 1 matchup against the Browns and missed week 2 against the Saints. He's questionable for week 3, but I still think once Jake Ferguson is back and healthy, he's going to be super solid. If he plays week 3, the Ravens have been very bad against the tight end position on the season. And then the Cowboys will play the Giants. The Steelers don't love that. And then the Lions. So they have some good opportunities before that week 7 bye outside of maybe that Pittsburgh game. But overall, this Cowboys offense just has not gotten off to a good start. The team as a whole has not gotten off to a good start, but they will be better. This was the highest scoring offense in the whole NFL last year. Jake Ferguson, of all tight ends, had the 2nd most red zone targets at the position in the NFL last year. And this is a team really kind of searching quickly for their identity early in the season, but they will be better. And Jake Ferguson, when healthy, will be a big part of that. The tight end position has been awful so far to start the season, but Ferguson, when he's healthy, is going to be a guy you can just plug in, take what you can get, and not worry too much about the fantasy points. And he's hurt. This is the perfect time to buy him low because he's hurt. He's probably clogging a roster spot for your league mate. So go out and try and trade for him. You shouldn't have to give up too much, even though he was drafted, as a kind of top tier tight end, at least in that mid tier. He's probably clogging a roster, especially if, your league mate has another tight end on their roster. Maybe they drafted later, maybe like a Brock Bowers. Like they're not worried about the tight end position. Maybe they scooped up a guy like Isaiah Likely that they just want to start throughout the season, or Hunter Henry, even though he looked bad last night. But you get it, right? Look at the roster for your Jake Ferguson owner, and he should, in most cases, be a very solid buy low that you don't have to give up a lot of capital for. So go out and trade for Jake Ferguson, before he's back and healthy. And speaking of top tier tight ends that are injured, let's move to Evan Engram. And same logic here. I know Evan Engram was very disappointing in week 1, but he will be better. He's been a top 5 tight end 2 years in a row in fantasy football. He's hurt, dealing with that hamstring injury. Don't know if he's going to play week 3. But this is why you want to go out and trade for him, because I know a lot of people have worries about this Jaguars offense, and I have concerns myself. But I think once Evan Engram is healthy, I know the week 1 performance is also worrisome, just 1.5 fantasy points off of 4 targets and 1 reception, but he will be better. I am confident in that. And even if this offense continues to struggle, there's no way that they won't get Evan Engram when healthy involved. So once again, a top tier, kind of mid-tier tight end that you should not have to give up a lot of capital for at the moment, even if he was drafted at a higher rate, because he's hurt. So go and look at these guys like Jake Ferguson and Evan Engram, see what you can get, make some offers, compare your team to their team, look at what other tight ends they have or don't have. Shouldn't have to spend a lot of trade capital on either player. I think both of these tight ends are excellent buy low candidates moving into week 3. And that'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, guys, I will answer all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So be sure if you need anything moving into week 3 that you drop a comment down below. I will answer your question before NFL's action on Sunday. Don't forget, guys, we have everything that you need for week 3 fantasy football live on the channel. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, must start kickers, our early waiver wire video for the week. Our last minute waiver wire video will come out tomorrow. We have running backs and wide receivers that are going to dominate the week, and we'll have a last minute everything that you need to know video coming out Sunday morning, as well as fantasy Q&A live streams throughout the entire week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. We really appreciate the support. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.